But this is no longer a joke, it's a real spy thriller in which Russia might be involved. On Saturday evening, Lindsey Graham, the main lobbyist for Ukraine in the US Senate, dies after returning from Kyiv the day before. Then on Sunday, it turns out that Mitch McConnell, another Republican senator who for years pushed through billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, ended up in the hospital. And just a month ago, he accused the Pentagon of sabotaging arms deliveries to Kyiv. Two key people behind American aid to Ukraine, all within 2 days. One died, the other ended up in the hospital, and the internet immediately exploded. The influential MAGA supporter, blogger, and close friend of Donald Trump, Laura Loomer, reminded her 2 million followers that Vladimir Putin's advisor, Alexander Dugin, had publicly called for the elimination of the American senator exactly 4 months before Lindsey Graham's death. A week before that, Iran had also called for Lindsey Graham to be killed. And here's a coincidence, let's put that word in quotes, of course. McConnell also ends up in the hospital. In this episode, we'll discuss 3 things. What really happened to Mitch McConnell? How did the conspiracy theory come about in just a few hours, and why does it look so convincing? And why do the facts most likely point to the opposite? And finally, the most important thing at the end. Fortunately, Lindsey Graham's push for sanctions against Russia did not die with him. It became even tougher, and Moscow will still feel the impact of Lindsey Graham. My name is Pechiy, and let's discuss all these topics together. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this channel. We're closing in on 300,000 subscribers. I'd be grateful if you subscribed. So, a real detective story is unfolding right now in Washington. Immediately after the death of Senator Lindsey Graham, literally the next day, another Ukraine lobbyist, Mitch McConnell, ends up in the hospital. It emerged that he hadn't shown up at work for several weeks, and this alone sparked rumors. On Sunday, the day after Lindsey Graham's death, he made a public statement. Here is his quote. "Doctors confirmed that I have no fractures or concussion. I did not have a heart attack or a stroke. I have neither a tumor nor a hemorrhage. However, I briefly lost consciousness and was taken to the hospital." It sounds just as strange as the story involving Lindsey Graham. He seemed healthy, had no complaints, but for some reason lost consciousness and almost died. Now Mitch McConnell is in a rehabilitation center. He can't return to the Senate chamber for voting yet, but according to him, he continues to work hard on the legislative agenda. Along with the statement, Mitch McConnell published a photo with his wife and with a Washington Post newspaper in his hands, open to the sports section of the Sunday issue. This is a classic trick, sort of like proof of the date the photo was taken. Like, look, I'm alive, this was taken today, I have today's newspaper in my hands, and so on. So Mitch McConnell understood what the difficulties were. Rumors about him will start spreading now in the wake of Lindsey Graham's death. You'd think Mitch McConnell is already 84 years old, and there's nothing unusual about this news. Well, sometimes old people end up in the hospital. But to understand why his hospitalization is also news, you need to know his roles. Mitch McConnell is the former leader of the Republicans in the Senate. The man who, during Joe Biden's presidency, pushed through billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, even in the face of resistance. His own Republican Party. He now chairs the subcommittee on defense appropriations. And now, doubts are arising within the US president's own administration. His latest high-profile move, Mitch McConnell's latest high-profile move, is extremely inconvenient for the administration. At the end of April, Mitch McConnell published a column in the Washington Post where he accused the Pentagon of sabotage. He stated at the time, "The $400 million approved by Congress for the purchase of American weapons for Kyiv is gathering dust in the Pentagon. The money is reserved. But the Department of Defense refuses to explain why they haven't been transferred." So he basically lashed out with accusations at the White House and the Pentagon. Next is a quote from Mitch McConnell. "Donald Trump's desire to end the war is a noble goal. However, the price of peace and its stability are also important. The Pentagon's approach of delaying support for Ukraine is essentially the same strategy that President Joe Biden has followed. Hesitation in providing Ukraine with the necessary assistance weakens its ability to defend itself against aggression and undermines the prospects for diplomatic negotiations. In other words, we are dealing with a person who publicly accused his own administration of stifling aid to Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, by the way, was even more hawkish and constantly called for aid to Ukraine, and suddenly one died, the other is in the hospital. And now even supporters of the MAGA movement suddenly saw a Russian connection in the stories of Graham and McConnell. Why is this surprising? Because MAGA, well, often were actually pro-Russian. They promoted Kremlin narratives. The American internet reacted instantly, and so Laura Loomer, she's a MAGA influencer with an audience of 2 million followers who is on a first-name basis with Donald Trump, was the first to speak up. On the day of Lindsey Graham's death, she writes a post on the social network X, quote, Alexander Dugin, one of Vladimir Putin's advisors, recently called for the killing of Senator Lindsey Graham. He said that the world would be better off without Graham. Yesterday, Lindsey Graham was in Ukraine, met with Zelensky, called for new sanctions against Russia, and promised more support for Ukraine. A day later, Lindsey Graham is dead. An investigation is needed. What this shows is that Laura Loomer is one of those Republicans who, throughout Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, has been promoting absolutely Russian narratives. But then in May, she sends her editor to Ukraine. He sees what's happening. He arrives exactly during those 2 days when Russia was massively bombing Ukrainian cities. She sees all of this and is just, blown away. She was in shock. Since then, she has declared that she is on Ukraine's side. I actually have a separate episode about her on this YouTube channel, so I recommend subscribing so you don't miss news like this. But Laura Loomer didn't stop there. Later, she writes, it's worth noting that Putin's advisor, Alexander Dugin, called to crush Lindsey Graham exactly 4 months ago. Did Russia just kill a US senator? Laura Loomer asks. Later, Loomer, now addressing the White House, writes again, quote, was Graham poisoned by a foreign adversary abroad or upon returning to the US? What do his staff mean by the phrase brief and sudden illness? Is it poison? Well, then she put all the pieces together, so to speak, and here's another quote from Laura Loomer. Russia just sent a delegation to Khamenei's funeral in Tehran, where the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the funeral organizers were calling for the deaths of me, President Trump, and Senator Graham. This is not a conspiracy theory. We need to know if Senator Graham was targeted by Iran or Russia for assassination. An immediate toxicology report is needed. And this is a very important point. Remember it for now, we'll come back to it later. She wasn't alone. Podcaster Clint Russell, also supposedly a conservative Republican, writes, Graham inspected a drone factory in Ukraine yesterday. Russia blew up that facility today. And tonight they announced that Graham is dead from an allegedly sudden illness. I would say that Russia blew up Lindsey Graham. Former Fox News producer Kylie Jane Kramer has already hinted at an Iranian connection. And conservative columnist Anthony Galley went even further, actually the furthest of all. He demanded that Trump launch, quote, Operation Lindsey Graham, that is, a military one, a response to Iran and Russia if they turn out to be involved in the senator's death. He says, let's just hit Iran and Russia if it turns out they're responsible for Graham's death. But as they say, these are all just bloggers. Yes, you could say, well, someone is making a fuss. But what really added fuel to the fire was FBI Director Kash Patel, who announced, here's his quote, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation is assisting local authorities and has provided all necessary resources. So, Kash Patel hinted that the FBI is actually conducting an investigation into the death of Lindsey Graham. But I'll be objective. Yes, right now the whole picture looks very convincing. Dugin, the Kremlin's ideologist, publicly demands, as he put it, that Graham be crushed. Iran declares Graham as a target. At the funeral of HMNI, there are calls to kill him. On July 10, Lindsey Graham announces in Kyiv that he has agreed with the White House on hellish sanctions against Russia. These are 500 tariffs on imports from countries buying Russian oil. On the evening of July 11, he is found dead. On July 12, the second senator who is also promoting aid to Ukraine ends up in the hospital. Well, if you lay out these facts in this order, the picture just forms by itself. 2 supporters of Ukraine, over just 2 days, one dies and the other ends up in the hospital. Now let's take a sober look at this situation. As for Lindsey Graham, the preliminary cause of death is a ruptured aorta. This is a classic, well-studied condition, extremely characteristic for men. Over 70 years old with hypertension, there is no autopsy report indicating signs of poisoning yet. There has been no official finding that a crime was committed. There is no evidence of involvement by Russia, Iran, or anyone else. And even Senator Tim Scott mentioned a heart attack. After returning from Ukraine, Graham complained of chest pain, so the symptoms were there before anything sudden happened. But the fact that the Federal Bureau of Investigation is involved in this story leads us to think that we just don't know all the details yet. About Mitch McConnell, he is 84 years old. He had polio as a child, and the consequences have started to show in the last couple of years. He has already fallen several times, broken bones, and lost consciousness. Once, right during a press conference, he froze. He just couldn't continue his speech. He just stood still. But again, it's just too strange a coincidence. Both Graham and McConnell are fierce supporters of Ukraine among the Republicans. But let's be honest, skepticism is not the same as certainty. You can be skeptical about different versions, but you can't be certain that they are untrue. The toxicology report on Lindsey Graham's death is not available yet, and Laura Loomer's request to conduct this investigation is not absurd in itself. Russia has a documented history specifically of poisonings. Litvinenko, the Skripals, Navalny, and Lindsey Graham was officially wanted in Russia and on their Russian list of terrorists and extremists, so the correct position, as it seems to me, is as follows. Show us the results of the toxicology report. Was Graham poisoned or not? If not, all questions are settled. But the main takeaway from this episode will unexpectedly be about something else. The Lindsey Graham case did not die with him. In the Kremlin, they apparently breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Graham's death would call into question new US sanctions against Russia. After all, it was Lindsey Graham who was pushing the idea of sanctions from hell against the Russian Federation, but the opposite happened. Today, July 13, a radically expanded version of this bill was introduced in the US Congress. Here's the key change and why you should watch until the end. I'll explain now. The old version of the bill, which was promoted by Lindsey Graham, sounded like this. Washington's response to Moscow's refusal to make peace depended almost entirely on the personal will of Donald Trump. That is, the sanctions hammer was on the table in the White House, but the decision to strike or not was made solely and exclusively by Donald Trump. And here is the new version of the bill. It goes like this. A significant part of the sanctions comes into effect automatically 30 days after this law is passed. Without Donald Trump, without his consent or his mood, without his bargaining with Vladimir Putin. It's simple. If Russia does not engage in peace negotiations, and it does not, it receives automatic sanctions. Moreover, the sanctions are all-encompassing. The financial sector, energy, shipping, investments, plus the main weapon remains in place. These tariffs are against any country that continues to buy Russian oil and gas. Plus, there will also be a blow to companies that help Russia circumvent sanctions. This bill already has 85 co-authors in the Senate, and that's already enough to overcome a presidential veto. And now Lindsey Graham's co-author, Democrat Richard Blumenthal, is demanding to speed up the vote. Putting it simply, Putin. He doesn't deserve any more time. Bottom line, the coincidences are creepy. The senator whom Alexander Dugin had demanded be crushed has died, and Iran sentenced him a day after he approved sanctions that could devastate the Kremlin's oil revenues. The next day, another senator who was advocating aid to Ukraine ends up in the hospital. And to put an end to all the manipulations, the investigation should finally publish the toxicology report on Graham's death. And what really matters is this. If anyone in Moscow was celebrating Graham's death, they popped the champagne too soon. Because the bill that was supposedly dying with its author has come back to life in a much more dangerous form. Previously, as they say, the sanctions sledgehammer was in Donald Trump's hands. He could choose to use it or not. Now, it will come down on its own. Basically, 30 days after this bill is passed. Graham is no longer around, but his hellish sanctions still remain. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments. I'm sure you'll have something to say about this episode. So write everything you think. You can also discuss this episode there. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the bell to get notifications about new episodes. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.